morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I am Temba Mashaba, Director of Little Big Ideas, 1/3 of the directors, that is. And we're very delighted for you to be joining us today in what can best be described as what Dr. Ndlozi would have said about this weather. It's cold, 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 and it is wrong. We are delighted that you have made the time this Saturday to join us for our second segment of LBI's Breakfast with a CEO, an initiative we started in April with Prof. Bonang Mohale, and we're very delighted today to be hosting one of my favorite CEOs in the country, Prof. Busisiwe Mavuso. Before we go in, I'd just like to set maybe somewhat the mood of today. Week 22 of 2021, Bloomberg released an article, rather a report with the heading, South Africa has the highest unemployment rate in the world. And to put that into more context, Bloomberg did this with the 83 countries that they are monitoring, to break down and to just paint the picture for you what that actually means and what that means in statistics. That means that 34.4% of actively looking job-seeking South Africans are currently unemployed, even though they are actively seeking for it. And when we check the expanded definition of it, we see that we are currently at 44.4%. This is inclusive of discouraged work seekers who are currently not looking for jobs. If we were to break that a bit further to paint the picture, if you were to include the youth percentile, between the ages of 15 and 24, we've got 64.4% of youth within that age range are currently unemployed. If you were to take it a bit higher, between 25 and 34 years of age, we've got 42.9% of youth within that age group that are currently unemployed. August is Women's Month, so I think it's only right that we also break down those unemployment stats and we look at how they're affecting women within our country. With Black women in the country, we've got 41% of them that are currently unemployed, compared to 8.2% of white women that are currently unemployed in the country. If you take it a bit further, Indian or Asian South African women, we've got 22.4%. And lastly, with colored women, South African colored women, we've got 29.9%. And of course, this is solely just the second quarter analytics of what the unemployment rate is right now. We have not factored in what recently happened with the riots in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng, where it's estimated that approximately 150,000 jobs have been lost or are lost in KZN, and approximately 14.5 to 15,000 jobs are going to be or are lost in Gauteng. To paint a much more bleak picture, that translates to probably 40,000 businesses that have been affected by those riots. You ask yourself, is COVID the only reason for all these stats going high? But if you take it back a bit, you take it back to 2009 ANC conference in Polokwane, where most political analysts and business analysts will now dub the years following 2019 as the 9 wasted economic years of South Africa. And just when we were thinking of rebuilding, when the Tumamina era started, COVID-19 affected us, and what most political analysts described as catapult or was a catalyst to moving us to where we are right now. I'm extremely happy today that Prof. Mavuso is going to be joining us on this segment, as she's going to be sharing on a very important segment of leadership, where leadership is both business and in political, working together is what is going to help us rebuild this country, rebuild this continent, so that we are competitive and are able to provide the jobs that are needed for our countrymen. So before I introduce her, let me just read her profile for you. Busisiwe Mavuso is a chartered certified accountant, CCA, qualified with Association of Certified Chartered Accountants, and holds a master's degree in business leadership, a postgraduate qualification in management from Gibbs, and a BCom in accounting from the University of South Africa. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa, an independent associate of the leaders of some of South Africa's biggest and most well-known organizations, a forum for engaging key players, including civil society and labor, to exchange ideas in the national interest and to create effective dialogue with government and other stakeholders. Busi is also a non-executive director on the board of ESCOM, Business Unity South Africa, which is also known as BUSA, and Resultant Finance, and serves on the Human Resources Development Council, the Advisory Committee of the Local Government Ethical Leadership Initiative, the Alcohol Industry Advisory Council, and the Social Justice Council. Furthermore, Busi is a visiting professor at Wits Business School. She was previously the Chief Operating Officer of BLSA. Prior to that, the Managing Director of the Business Management Forum, during which she was responsible for driving the overall strategy of the organization, including its representation at various public forums and at the request of the Business Management Forum President or Deputy President. Before assuming this role, Busi served as the Chief Financial Officer and Operations Director of the BMF, having joined it in May. She started her career in finance in 1995, and over the last 25 years has been experienced in a range of industries ranging from training, consulting, telecoms, and the healthcare sectors. Busi is a member of the YPO, the IOD, and ACCA. She was awarded the 2020 Influencer of Influencers Award by the African Brand in October 2020. And I'm hoping by the end of today, I can add to that also mentor of Themba Mashava. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Prof. Busisiwe Mavuso, who's going to be leading us, after which we're going to have a Q&A session before we conclude today's Breakfast with a CEO webinar.
Themba, good morning. Am I supposed to come on?
Yes, please.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. So it's actually a pleasure, for me to come and have this conversation this morning. And as I've said, thank you very much for the invitation. And I like where you have started this conversation, Themba, and I like how you are framing the context of where we find ourselves as a country, during this time. And I absolutely like the topic that you've requested me to come and address this morning, the topic of business leadership that is needed for the post-COVID era. And I must say that I really think that this is a befitting topic because really what we have experienced as the world, and definitely as a country in the past 18 months, is a classical black swan event. And it's also appropriate that we look at the role that business ought to be playing going forward. So yes, there is a lot that business should be doing, but because we only have 30 minutes, I have chosen to lean into this topic by looking at one necessary intervention required from business. So there could be a lot of things that I actually talk to, but because of the time limitations, I would rather just focus on the one area, as it were. And it's a topic that is very close to my heart, Themba. So given the economic devastation experienced by our country during COVID, I have no doubt in my mind that the intervention required from business is this notion that we discussed at the World Economic Forum in January 2019, which is really gaining serious momentum and popularity as it should, by the way, this notion of stakeholder capitalism or conscious capitalism or capital with a conscience, as others call it. And let me tell you why. Advancing conscious capitalism is actually self-serving for us as business. It's a pity we don't see it as business at the moment, because if we realized it and if we saw it, we wouldn't be sitting in an environment that we are currently sitting in as South Africa. And the stats that you have just painted, Themba, would definitely not be so if we had a business constituency that realized the critical role that it can play if it were to actually usher in this notion of conscious capitalism. And it's interesting for me because I don't know how business doesn't get it. And Themba, I'm choosing to speak about the role of business. I'm going to leave government, for aside for a while, because I think I've got very strong views, by the way, in terms of what government ought to be doing. But I think it's also necessary that at some point we shine a spotlight on what business in this country ought to be doing. So it's interesting for me that as business, we don't realize that advancing conscious capitalism is actually self-serving for us. It is self-serving because it will be investing in our future markets and in our sustainability as a constituency. And let me explain it this way. You see, South Africa has a fundamentally flawed social structure. You see, the countries that will experience a better post-COVID era are those that will quickly bounce back from this crisis. And it will be those countries that have got a diamond social structure, which means that you've got 10% of the citizens which are opulent, 80% of the citizens which are sitting in the middle class, and only 10% of the citizens which are poor. Because you see, it is the middle class that carries economies, not the rich. Our structure as South Africa is a pyramid structure, or rather a triangle structure, where you have 10% of the population living in opulence, 35% which is in the middle class, and more than 50% of our people actually living in abject poverty. Interestingly enough, I recently had a conversation with a group of economists, and they spoke about a 2080 social structure. And in asking where that comes from, they said there are many studies conducted in the recent past in South Africa which show that the middle class in South Africa is a fallacy. So this structure of a pyramid structure of 10, 35, and more than 50 actually no longer exists. That is how bad we have gotten as a country. So the middle class apparently in South Africa is a fallacy, because according to this group of economists and according to the studies that have been recently conducted, the middle class in this country doesn't exist. And that is a problem. But I think that is a conversation for another day. But let me just say this. It is a problem because, as I said, it doesn't matter where in the world you go. If you understand Economics 101, you will know that it is the middle class that carries economies, not the rich. So if South Africa is sitting with a social structure of 2080, 20% of the haves and 80% of the have-nots, who then is going to carry our economy? It therefore goes without saying that it makes sense why our economy and COVID has actually devastated our economy the way we are experiencing it. And it makes sense that we are sitting with the unemployment stats, Themba, that you have actually shared. You see, if you have a diamond-shaped economy, you have more people who have disposable income and who can afford to buy your goods and services as a business. And maybe let me park that for a minute. I will come back to it. I don't know how many of you, and I think Themba has already shared with us, you know, a lot of you should have seen or would have read the unemployment stats, in the country. I'm not going to repeat them. 44% in terms of the expanded definition, 65% youth unemployment. We have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. Now, I don't care which way you choose to look at it. Let's agree that this is a recipe for disaster. More people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. We are sitting in a country where you have 43% of households accessing at least one social grant. Actually, this is even old stats. If you factor in the COVID devastation, if you factor in the recent riots that we've experienced as a country, you will see that the 43% of households at least accessing one social grant, that number has actually gone up. And if you look at the economic devastation that has actually happened, you will see that more people are actually living in poverty. You see what happens in South African households or within South African households, and what social structure looks like for South Africa, or what our social structure looks like, is important, because 60% of our GDP in this country is attributable to household expenditure. So this deep and persistent crisis of unemployment is a recipe for disaster. It cannot be right to sit in a country where 60% of your citizens are subjected to abject poverty, and you are sitting in an environment where you are the most unequal society in the world. Colleagues, I'm trying to paint a picture of our social structure. The stats say, and again, these are the old stats, 58% of the income that is produced in this country or that is available for distribution in this country accrues to the top 10% of the population. 58% of the income accrues to the top 10% of the population. And then 30% of the income that is available for distribution in this country accrues to the 35%, which is the middle class, if they still exist, by the way. And as I'm saying, these are the old stats. And the bottom 50% of the population only earn 10% of the income. We are sitting in an environment where you have only 7 million people who earn enough to pay as you earn, and you have 18 million people dependent on some form of social grant or the other. Now, this doesn't make economic sense. South Africa has 1.7 million people paying 80% of the income, or rather of the income tax, and that definitely cannot be sustainable. I was shocked to learn that the reason why we introduced the national minimum wage as a country, and remember the national minimum wage is only 3,500 rands. And we introduced this, if I'm not mistaken, I think around 2017 or 2016. The reason why we introduced the national minimum wage as a country was because 43% of South Africans employed were going to benefit from it. 43% of people earning a salary and less than 3,500 rands per month. Now, those are people who have to wake up from the townships, from whatever rural areas, who have to take 2 or 3 taxis, to go to work, and they would do that day in, day out, and spend more than 12 or probably maybe 15 hours of their days working, only to take home 3,500, or only to take home less than 3,500 rands per month. Now, that social structure doesn't make sense. And as I've said, let's take those numbers with a pinch of salt, because the picture is worse right now, precisely because of the COVID devastation and precisely because of the riots that we experienced. Now, let's go back to the thought that I asked you to pack, which is that advancing conscious capitalism is actually self-serving for us as business. It is self-serving because it is investing in our future markets and it is investing in our sustainability as business. That is why a diamond-shaped economy makes sense, because it means you have more people who have disposable income, who can afford to buy your goods and services as a business, and you can clearly see that in our case, we definitely don't have this picture. You see, if business were to pay more attention in investing in communities and using their capital for the broader good of society and make sure that it advances the transformation agenda, because that is what conscious capitalism means. It is, in plain English, it is really this notion of advancing the transformation agenda. If business were to take seriously this agenda, it would mean that our social structure as a country will change towards being more of a diamond-shaped economy. And as I said, with a diamond-shaped economy, you have more people as a business that can actually afford your goods and services. And because people can now afford to buy your goods and services, it means that as a business, you can produce more. And if you can produce more because the demand is increased, it means that you need to hire more people. And if you need to hire more people as a business, it means unemployment decreases. But the other side of the coin is that people being employed means that they are earning salaries. And because they earn salaries, they can pay as you earn. And because they can pay as you earn, tax revenues increase. And because tax revenues increases, it therefore means there's more available to the fiscus. And if there is more available to the fiscus, it means that government does not therefore have to carry so many people as it is currently doing. I think you get the drift, colleagues. The point I'm making is really economics 101. And in case some of you are asking yourselves the question of why the issue of transformation has to be placed at the door of business. Well, for me, the answer is simple, really. Because you see, ours as South Africa is an incomplete transition. Let's be clear, colleagues. What we achieved in this country in 1994 was democracy. Now, democracy is a political system. It is not justice, neither is it equality. And maybe, just maybe, we made the fundamental mistake in 1994 to think that it is. Colleagues, we are talking about the leadership that is required from business in the post-COVID era. And I'm making the case that conscious capitalism is the answer. Of course, the role of transformation does not solely rest on the shoulders of business, and business is not exclusively to blame for the evils of our history and the disappointment of the present. But as a grouping that has levers to economic power, business does have a special responsibility. It does have a social responsibility, and it has a critical role to play in this regard. Now, let's get this straight. South Africa's social injustice is business's crisis as much as it is government's. We have a special responsibility to work firmly towards this agenda, because you see, some things are bigger than self-interest and they are bigger than the profit motive. And those are issues of national interest. And these need to be elevated above all. And they cannot just be left to government, because unfortunately for us, if government fails in this country, then South Africa is going to fail. And if South Africa fails, then business fails. And you know what they say. They say, show me a failed state and I'll show you a failed nation. So if our state fails, then it means we would have failed as well as a nation. The recent riots that we experienced as a country in early July, I'm hoping that they have given us a different perspective in terms of how to engage with these issues, especially as business. Now, if the recent riots do not make us as business leaders to carefully think about how we sustainably start to deal with our structural economic flaws, then I don't know what will. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the biggest ticking time bomb that we have in this country is inequality. And the problem about domestic inequality is that it undermines social stability. And the manifestation of social instability is precisely the anarchy that we recently experienced as a country. You see, we were certainly naive as a country to think that the two economies, one nation, would not at some point lead to an existential crisis for the majority of our people who are subjected to abject poverty. It was naive of us to think that the residents of Alexander are going to continue to look at the opulence of Sentin from the windows of their shacks. We should have known that at some point their poverty would drive them out of their shacks to cross the M1 bridge and render Sentin ungovernable. You see, the economic vulnerability of some segments of society, unfortunately, increases the economic vulnerability for all of us. You know, interestingly, in 2009, a colleague and I had this conversation. It's a conversation that we have all the time, but what he said actually stuck with me. That's why I know that it was in 2019. And we're obviously reflecting on these issues. And he said, you know, we are in a very dangerous territory as a country where we have way too many people who have nothing to lose. He said, I remember when that was me at some point in my life in this country, much younger. He said, we used to go out to face R1 rifles with sticks and stones. And he said, going out there, we knew that three things can happen to you. You will either die, you will either get shot, or you will get paralyzed. But because we had nothing to lose, we didn't care. He said, as a country, you don't want to have too many people who have nothing to lose. You want the opposite of that. Because if people have something to lose, they think before they act. They become somehow moderated. We need to give people a reason to wake up in the morning. Too many people in South Africa are seeing symbols of wealth and aspects of a life that they do not have a stake in. And our focus needs to be on providing a stake for people who feel left out. That is why they could loot a shop rant that they utilize every day to buy bread and milk and whatever the case is, because they see this as a symbol of wealth and they don't have a stake in it. And they're thinking that, you know, whether I destroy it or not, they are not even thinking about the fact that actually I am going to be disadvantaged if I destroy this shop right, because it would mean that I would now have to have taxi fare, right? To go and buy, I don't know, the cheap bread that ShopRite offers me, you know, somewhere else. No, they didn't think about that. They didn't think about that because what they see in front of them, they do not have a stake in. Now, how do we change that? And that is what our focus needs to be as a country. Colleagues, no nation in the world can achieve inclusive economic growth by excluding the majority of the citizens of its country. Unfortunately for us, as long as the poor won't eat, then the rich will not sleep. Actually, this is no longer about the rich and poor, the same way that it is no longer about black and white. This is about the haves and the have-nots. And maybe let me rephrase this. As long as the have-nots will not eat, then we as the haves will not sleep. We cannot go to war as a country with only 10% of our citizens. And that is the mistake we are making as a country. If you have a social structure where only 10% of the citizens are living in opulence, it therefore means you think you can go to war with only 10% of your soldiers. It doesn't make sense. And that is why conscious capitalism or the transformation agenda for me is critical to be driven forcefully by business, because you see, business can only prosper in a prosperous society. If you are not living in a prosperous society, let's agree that the anarchy that we experienced at the beginning of July was the first of many to come. You see, the focus by business leadership ought to be transformation in the post-COVID era, because we have all seen how one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has exposed is just how fractured our democracy is and just how unequal we are as a society. I don't know how many of you saw this. There was an interesting text that was doing the rounds when this COVID pandemic started. So this was March 2020. It was a text that was posted by an Indian doctor, and he was saying this in the context of India. But when I read the text, it was interesting for me because what he was saying resonated for me in the South African context as well. He was referring to just how the ways to prevent this coronavirus seem to be accessible only to the affluent. He was saying that we are told that to deal with the virus, you have to constantly wash your hands. He says, if that is interesting for me, because it assumes that everyone in this country has got running water. And yet, for instance, in the South African context, we know that the luxury, or rather, running water is a luxury that many of our people do not have. He said that we are told to sanitize our hands constantly. He says, and that assumes that you have the money to buy the sanitizer in the first place. And yet we forget that we live in a country where so many of our people are still trying to satisfy their basic and security needs in terms of the Maslow's hierarchy. He says we are told to stay at home, which assumes that you can afford to do so. And yet we know that we live in a country in the South African context where the majority of our people are employed in the informal sector, which therefore means they make their living on a day-to-day basis. So if they do not wake up, if they are forced to stay at home, and they do not wake up and go and make a living, it means that they have nothing to put on the table in terms of food or provision for their families that night. We were told that we need to social distance, and that assumes that you have a privilege of living in a big house. And yet we know that for so many of our citizens, a lot of our people are living on top of each other, which is why, by the way, the lockdown was ineffective in the townships. You see, the reason, as I said, why the hard lockdown did not make sense and did not work in the townships was that, and I don't have to tell you this, I know you know it, but a lot of our people are living in RDP houses and in informal settlements, or in 3-roomed houses where I grew up in White City, Jabavu, in Soweto. So that means that you cannot all be in the house at the same time. So whether you like it or not, you see how cold it is this morning, but I promise you, if I were to phone my brother, who still lives in my grandmother's house in White City, Jabavu, he will tell me, or if I were just get into my car and drive there, you will see so many kids already on the streets, as cold as it is, as early as it is. Now, and you and I look at it, and it is the same thing at 8 o'clock in the evening, at 9 o'clock in the evening, and you and I look at it and we're saying, whose kids are these? Where are their parents? What are they doing running around in the streets at this hour of the night? And we forget that as soon as you wake up, if I have to clean the house or whatever the case is, I can't have people in the house. So the poor kids have no choice but to wake up and go outside of the house. Some of them, when they eat just outside of their shacks. They sit with their little cups of tea and their brown bread slices just outside of their shacks because there isn't enough room in the house for them to be able to do so. Now, on the other hand as well, while your and my kids' education was not interrupted as a result of this crisis, we know that for the majority of the kids in this country and elsewhere in the world, this is not the case. You know, I was shocked when my helper told me, my helper is from Zimbabwe. I was shocked when she told me that the schools in Zimbabwe closed in March 2020. Up until today, 18 months later, the schools have not reopened. Those kids have not received any education for the past 18 months. And I think you and I know firsthand, and we have experienced it firsthand, that the surest way of lifting yourself and your family from poverty and from one social class to the next is through education. And that there is no tool more effective for development than education. And many of us are living proof of that. So if as a country, we can't even provide these kids with education, and I'm not even talking about decent education yet, I'm merely referring to basic education. If we as a country cannot provide these kids with education, what it means is that the poor get poorer, and just like their parents, these kids will grow up to be dependent on the fiscus through social grants. What it means is that our kids have lost the race before they've even begun running it. That is what we are subjecting our kids to if we don't exercise this notion of conscious capitalism, or if we don't forcefully drive the transformation agenda. You know, I'm very clear in my mind that the conditions for people to prosper are not God-given. They are created, and through conscious capitalism, business can create those opportunities for many South African citizens. Now, in his book called The Outlier, Malcolm Gladwell says, success is not a random act. He says it arises out of a predictable and powerful set of circumstances and opportunities. Now, as business leaders in this country, we have an obligation to create those predictable set of circumstances and opportunities for people. It cannot be right that your success as a person or as a human being has to be determined by which side of the M1 bridge you were born. Actually, for most of us, success is actually a function of necessity. We work our hands to the bone because we have to. We work very hard, not because we like it, but because we have to, because we don't have a choice. For most of us, success, or rather our success, is propelled by where we come from. It is less about determination and will. It is more about having to lift yourself out of the poverty that you came from. We need to level the playing field, because the reality in this country is that sometimes even the most gifted of us cannot escape the limitations of our circumstances or the limitations of our environment. Actually, some of us, some of our parents included, could have been more successful in a different kind of world, or could have been more successful in a different kind of era, or could have been more successful in a different country. Even the most gifted of us cannot escape the limitations of our environment. And for me, that is the reason, Themba, that the business leadership that is required during this time is, or rather in the post-COVID era, is this notion of conscious capitalism, or it is to have business forcefully drive the transformation agenda. Themba, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mavuso. I think you shared quite a few, not a few, but a lot of gems that that we need to actually think about, because I see in the attendees here, we've got startup entrepreneurs, we've got managers, we've got all these different people that not only are meant to be commentators of economic activity, but should, from their place of operation, be effectors of the economy. I like one of the things that, the main thing for me that you said is that post the COVID-19 era, transformation is non-negotiable. We need to level the playing field where we move from a triangle to a more diamond economic operations. So not to hog the mic, we're going to open up the Q&A session. I see Mr. Mandla Ntukwane already asked a question. So what we're going to do is you're going to raise your hand, and as soon as you raise your hand, I'm going to unmute your mic so you can ask Prof. Mavuso the questions that you have been bottling up until now. So ladies and gentlemen, just raise your hand and the platform will be yours. Oh, Mr. Ntukwane, I'll start with you. I saw Mr. Hanyani Makumbadi as well had raised his hand. Okay, there we go. You may speak, sir.
Thank you very much, Busi, for joining us this morning. Just a question on my side. I think, when I think about capitalism or conscious capitalism as you describe it, by nature, it results in creating an elitist society. So if we look at what will happen in the future is, even if we move with conscious capitalism, the people who currently own 100% of the economy, or say 100 rand in the economy, versus the people who own 1 rand will move up to 1,000, and those people will move up to 100, hopefully. But the gap remains the same, and as a result, the people who've moved up from 1 rand to 100 rand will still feel like they've been left behind. Is that not counterintuitive and will basically leave us in the same position? Thank you.
Okay, Prof, I think you can answer that question for us.
Thanks. So Manda actually makes a very interesting point, to say that by design, capitalism is probably not designed, or it doesn't exist actually, probably maybe to do good. It probably maybe exists to extract as much as it can, for the benefit of the shareholder interest. And as I said, that the conversation that we had at the beginning of, or rather at the beginning of 2019 at the World Economic Forum, is this notion of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. And I think it is clear, and remember, the World Economic Forum is a global conversation. It is not a South Africa conversation, so it is bigger than us. So if we are having a conversation at that level, it therefore means that there is an appreciation the world over that the narrow interests that are being driven by capitalism are actually not going to work. But then let me leave the global agenda. Let me come to South Africa. Now, in South Africa, Mandla, we are very clear that by driving this notion of conscious capitalism, you are therefore driving the transformation agenda. We are very clear that out of the 4 social partners that we have as a country, business is the only social partner that has got disproportionate resources. And because it has disproportionate resources, it needs to be held accountable. Now, this is the reason why you have the Affirmative Action Act, why you have the Employment Equity Act, why you have the BBBE Act. And maybe let's not look at the technicalities of why these acts, or rather let's not look at the technicalities of the acts in terms of how they are designed, leave aside the technicalities. Look at the spirit of why we have this legislation in the first place. We have this legislation because there is an appreciation in this country that ours is a very abnormal society. Through this legislation, we are trying to normalize South Africa. We are trying to normalize South Africa because we come from an environment where the majority of the citizens of this country were deliberately left out of participating in the economic mainstream, as it were. Now, when capital comes into the country, you give it marching orders. And for me, this is where our government policy has failed. This is where you see the imperfection of the BBBE legislation, where, to your point, Mandla, it is driving elitism. But you see, this is bigger than that. This is not just about BBBE. You know, if you were to read a book by Professor Sam Peter Blanche, which is titled Lost in Transformation. The book was published in 2012. In that book, Sam Peter Blanche is very clear that what we are sitting with as a country, the reason why we are failing to advance the transformation agenda is precisely because of this elite compromise that we agreed to when we took over this country in 1994. Now, I don't want to get into the semantics as to whether it was right or wrong, right? Or whether, you know, because we all know that it was not a negotiation of equals in 1994 or in 1990, between 1990 and 1993, you know, between the ANC and the National Party. It was not a negotiation of equals. So the many codessas that we had, you know, we don't know what happened there. But let's agree that, or the fact is that there was an elite compromise. And the elite compromise basically said that we are going to give you the country that you want, so you can have the country. But be clear, you are not going to mess with our assets. You are not going to mess with the land. You are not going to impose any funny legislation that will need us to redistribute our wealth or to distribute our wealth to. There was a lot of terms and conditions that this National Party government, because the ANC had their backs against the wall, there were many terms and conditions that they had to agree to. So it therefore means that our democracy was founded on a fundamental, or rather on a fundamentally flawed basis. And it was fundamentally flawed because it was not a negotiation of equals. The elite compromise said that, yes, we are going to empower some of you, not all of you. There are way too many of you for us to empower. So even if we were to try, we are not going to be able to do so. So give us an indication of who are those people that need to be empowered. So when you talk about the elite compromise, or when you talk about the elite or the capitalism system, which is actually creating the elite, Mandla, it is not by default, it is by design. It is by design because for whatever reason, and I'm not pointing fingers, because I don't know the conditions upon which, you know, those negotiations were held. I don't know what the ANC leadership was confronted with or how tough those negotiations were. I can only imagine, you know, what the poor old man, after having spent so many years in prison, had to actually contend with. But the reason why capitalism produces elitism is precisely because at some point in this country, in 1994, when we took over this country, we agreed to the elite compromise. It is for that reason that even when you have the Commission of Employment Equity Report, which comes out year after year by the Department of Labor, which says that, no, this private sector of yours is not transforming. You know, when you look at the stats, and I haven't seen the latest report, but I can tell you now, the numbers have not moved much. When you look at who occupies the executive positions in the private sector, you will see that it is 70% white males, and we only are still in the last time I checked, I think we were in 24% as Black people, you know, who occupy positions of power in corporate South Africa. And when you look at the Black African women, the number is even worse. There is only 4% of us, if that number has not gotten worse. So we know this. as this ANC-led government. We know that the private sector doesn't conform to these policies or to this legislation. They are even so arrogant that they even budget for the penalties, to say we are not going to conform, we are going to hire who we want to hire. And if you want to penalize us, it's fine, we've got all the money in the world, go ahead and penalize us. But you see, the penalties don't even come, for whatever reason, I don't know, the Department of Labor never issues the penalties. So you're sitting in an environment where the private sector has now realized that whether you conform to this legislation, whether you drive the transformation agenda or you don't, nothing is going to happen. So we need to get to a point, for me, where you give the private sector or you give capitalism the marching orders and they should conform. When capital and when investment goes into other countries, they know it is a non-negotiable mandate that this is how much of the indigenous people you are going to involve. These are the targets that you are going to conform to. This is the period over which you are going to have to drive the transformation agenda. This is how much stake or ownership that you actually have to give, to government or to the people or whatever the case is. Namibia, I think just in 2017 or something like that, introduced legislation like that. I think they said it was 25% of equity had to be given to the Namibian government just a few years ago. Now, I look at it and I say, as I said earlier on, Mandla, conditions for people to prosper are not given, are not God-given. They are created, and in my view, they are created through policy. Now, policy exists for a reason. It is through policy that we should drive the transformation agenda. Now, let me make this very unfortunate example before I pause, Themba. In 1947, or was it 48, when the National Party government took over South Africa after the long reign of the English power, they took over South Africa in 1948, and they had a very clear agenda. Their agenda was that we are going to be, or rather, they had clearly crafted their problem statement. And the problem statement that they had for themselves was that we want to drive the poor Afrikaner agenda. We are going to make sure that when all is said and done, there isn't a poor Afrikaner in this country. And today, you have the Stellenbosch Mafia because the National Party was very deliberate and intentional through policy to advance the Afrikaner people in this country. Now, they set up a SASOL to drive the Afrikaner agenda. They set up an IDC to drive the Afrikaner agenda. They didn't care whether you had Standard 2 or you didn't see, or you didn't set foot in a school or you had matric or whatever cases, you would be given employment in these SOEs. The reason why the technical skills in this country still remain with the Afrikaners, is because the government was very clear also in creating these technical colleges, in creating these centers of excellence in an ESCOM to create boiler makers, to make sure that these Afrikaners have got the technical skills. It was not about how much education you had. Even when you did not have your full mental faculties, right? They would still give you a job as a ticket examiner in a train. I come from an era where I used to use train. So when you get into a train, while you are sitting, a ticket examiner will pass and they will want to see your ticket and they will keep it. Now that is all those people did. So you didn't have to be 100% in the head, to do that, but the government was very clear that the agenda they were driving was to ensure that they deal with the poor Afrikaner problem. Now, Mandla, let me ask you this. What is the problem statement that we have as a country, or that we had as a country when we took over this country in 1994, if we had any, by the way? And where are we in terms of advancing that agenda? Where are we in terms of ensuring the delivery of that problem statement? Because you see, if you don't have clarity in terms of the outcome and the results that you would like to achieve, you are going to sit in this problem that we find ourselves in. If you are not clear that I'm going to drive the transformation agenda at all costs, then you are going to sit 27 years later as you are sitting, and you are actually going to be having these conversations that don't make sense. If you are not clear about your problem statement, you will sit in an environment where the Gini coefficient in 1994 was 0.54. Fast forward 27 years later, you're sitting with a Gini coefficient of 0.67. Now, all of us would know that the Gini coefficient is the measure of inequality in the country. 0 is a perfectly equal society. 1 is a perfectly unequal society. The more the number moves to the 1, it means you are becoming more and more unequal as a society. We took over as the most unequal society in the world in 2018, and we took this from Brazil. So there are more people who are actually worse off than what they were in 1994, precisely because we took our eye off the ball as a country, precisely because we were probably maybe not clear in terms of what is it that we want to usher in for our people. We shouldn't be having so many people who have nothing to lose 27 years later if we were clear about our agenda. So my view, Mandla, is that capital, if they want to invest in this country, because capital invests for 2 reasons only: for a potential to make profit and for markets. And we know that we have a market, not only as South Africa, but as Africa. Remember, investment comes into South Africa because their overarching agenda is to capture the African market, is to capture this 1.5 billion people that exist in the African continent. So they use South Africa as a gateway to access the African continent. So why are we not utilizing that advantage that we have as a country? If we know that we are the most advanced economy in the continent, and it makes sense for capital to lay their roots here, how are we utilizing it to benefit the majority of the citizens of this country? Because if we were to give them the terms, I promise you, if they see a market and if they see a potential to make profit, they will still invest. They are not going to walk away, but for whatever reason, we continue to treat them with kids' gloves, when other countries are not doing that. And as I'm saying, it is probably maybe a bigger conversation that you and I can resolve right now, because, we don't know what happened in the CODESA negotiations, and we don't know what compromises, this ANC-led government actually had to make to ensure, that they could usher in the democracy that you and I are currently living in right now. Themba, thank you very much.
Wow. Mandla has a follow-up question. Am I correct, Mandla? I see no more hands from other people. So
yeah, that's correct.
Mandla to follow up, and then we are going to wrap up. The one.
Thanks, Themba. So, Busi, thank you very much. I think, my thinking or my predetermined answer was very similar to what you outlined when answering my question. But I think as a South African, my heart breaks for the social fabric of this country. I'll play my hand a bit more. So I work with one of your colleagues at Rothschild, Martin Kingston, and I'm an investment banker. That's what I do on a daily basis. I structure these BE deals. And I know that even, such a good initiative of BE transformation at the ownership level has been hijacked by, capitalist objectives. And we are able to, I don't know, if you don't have real capital to transact, a company can come across as having been transformed when the structures are underwater and there is no transformation. So I don't know how we resolve that. As it relates to, transformation, where I'm conflicted a bit, to be honest, is how does a person remain true to, their roots? I'm Black. I want to see real transformation, but also success for me means that, the more BE deals I can structure for this international clients, the better. And some of them are really like nonsense deals, like speaking very candidly. It's a real conflict. And as a result, because our success is linked to the existence of these international companies that we must treat with like kid gloves, we don't have a lot of like wiggle room, and that's the reality. Do you see things differently, or is that sort of like a fallacious view?
So, Mandla, I definitely share your sentiments. So before BLSA, Mandla, I was at the BMF, as Themba has said, and probably most of you know what the BMF is. The BMF is the Black Management Forum, and it exists to try and usher this transformation agenda in corporate South Africa. And we know that as much as the BMF is now a 47-year-old organization, we are still failing to drive the transformation agenda, you know? And, you know, I look at it and I say, number one, the monitoring and evaluation or lack thereof of transformation in South Africa by government is a real problem because, and I know that Zodwa Ntuli, the BBB commissioner, is doing her best, you know, in terms of trying to your point, pick out these deals that look like transformation, but are not, you know, and she's very clear in terms of pushing back, you know, to say that if there's never going to be economic benefits that flow to the beneficiaries, then you can't call it a BBB deal, you know, and a lot of these deals are actually structured like that. So they will bring you there, you know, it will look transformed in terms of ownership, whatever the case is, but when you look at what point do economic benefits flow, you know, you look that it actually never does. There are a lot of terms of conditions, stringent terms and conditions that they put in place to ensure that the benefits never flow. Now, that is a fundamental problem. You know, when I once had this discussion with Professor Ben Turok, the late of the ANC, and similar to and that's why I say that, you know, we have come too far with this thing, and I think it's way too complex, you know, and maybe let me just come out, you know, and say, I don't want to talk politics, I'm not a politician, but I'm a South African who's impacted by this thing, a South African whose family still lives in Soweto, a South African who carries this, you know, burden of having to carry so many people or so many of your family members because you are still the only one, you know, who has made it. And you know that the rest of those that have not made it, it's not from a lack of trying. It is precisely because the system fundamentally prevents so many of our people from meaningfully participating, you know, in the economic mainstream. So maybe let me say, you know, honestly, personally, I'm very angry at the ANC. I was talking earlier on about the elite rule that they actually had to come up with. Now, when I spoke to Professor Ben Turok, Professor Ben Turok also shared with me the non-aggression pact that they actually had to agree to as the ANC. It was a pact between the ANC and white power. It was a political pact in 1994, which clearly said to the ANC, you are going to take political power. But that is all we are giving you, political power. You are not going to mess with anything else. Now, Mandla, that is the system that you and I operate in. It doesn't matter how they have designed the system to look differently from what it actually is. But the system that you and I operate in, we sit in these companies, you know, we have these positions, you know, you try so much to, within your power, to drive things to a particular direction. But because you don't understand the system that you're operating in, you know, you still continue to fail. You know, let's agree. And, you know, I think it is obvious to a lot of us, you know, that things don't move until or unless the Stellenbosch Mafia say, it's okay, you can hit the continue button on that one. And if it's uncomfortable for them, then they say, you are not going to do that, hold on. That is the environment that we're sitting with. So we might, and you know, as much as I don't agree with the EFF, you know, who says that drive these people to the sea, but I think a lot of what they say, by the way, is rubbish. But I really think that somewhere, somehow, they've got a point. They got a point because they know the inside workings, of these issues. And although they are also captured by their all masters, but they've got a clear sense in terms of where this thing is locked and what needs to be done to unlock it. So and again, as you said, Themba, I know you want to move on, and maybe let me pause here. Mandla, the system that you and I are operating in is bigger than us. The mechanics and the agreements that were made, by those who came before us, continue to perpetuate this system of oppression and dispossession that was there before 1994. So I understand your frustration. I understand where you're coming from. I understand how corporate South Africa is actually, I don't know whether I should say it's a fallacy or it's actually, it's false in so many ways, and a lot of what we do is not designed to benefit people who look like you and me. Far from
Completely agree. Thank you very much. That's a very profound and very helpful answer. Themba, over to you, sorry.
Thanks, man.
No need to apologize, Ndukwan. I think this is the reason why we prefer to have these conversations around food at a reserved restaurant rather than online. There's so much that we still need to break bread on, but time is not on our side. I saw Ms. Riabetsu Molapo's hand was up. I'm not sure if you still want to ask a question. That is going to be the last question that we answer, and then I'm going to come back and close. Ms. Molapo, please just signal me if you still have a question to ask. Okay. You can ask your question.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mavusi. Thank you so much, for this. Like, my brain is now just all over. And thank you for the sentiments that you've given us with respect to shared value and its importance within, bringing in the change that is required. And I think a lot of people assume that, these kinds of changes are supposed to be done by nonprofits. However, businesses, as you've mentioned, other people or the organizations that actually have that power. But as a owner of a startup, and I would say somebody who's at the bottom of the food chain, my question to you would be: how would you advise a young Black female startup owner to I guess to get into the loops? I mean, we're talking about something that's as huge as a system that's been around for centuries. How do we help break that? How do we break the mindset limitedness? How do we break, the economic? How do we break through those glass ceilings that we need to? Where do we go? Like, literally break it down. Say, as in terms of Roberto, I think at this point, this is where you need to go. Be affiliated with this. Do this and do that. Just, I guess, in a very short, summated way. Thank you.
So you're asking this question in the context of an entrepreneur, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So, and the SMME agenda is also a very interesting one. And honestly, my honest answer is that I don't know. And I don't know because I know that, so BLSA is the only organization of CEOs in the country, and I mainly represent big business. So just to give you a sense, the CEOs that I sit with are CEOs of JSE listed companies and CEOs of multinationals. And Mandla spoke about Rothschild, and I sit with Martin Kingston, who's I think the executive chair now of Rothschild at BLSA. So to give you a sense of what BLSA represents or who it represents, my board is made up of, I sit with Mike Brown, CEO of Nedbank, as the deputy chair of BLSA. I have Nku Nyembezi as the chairperson of BLSA. She's the chairperson of Standard Bank. She's the chairperson of the JSE, and she's the chairperson of Alexander Forbes. I sit with Lumisa Fuzile, who's the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa, as a board member. I sit with Shelima Chaba, CEO of PwC, as a board member. I sit with Shamil Drosa, CEO of Vodacom, as a board member. I sit with Leila Fori, CEO of the JSE, as a board member. I sit with Nolita Farude, executive chairperson, I think, of Anglo-American, as a board member. I sit with Dominic Suela, CEO of Balloweld. I sit with Mpumi Madisa, CEO of Bidvest. Now, that is just to give you a sense of the big companies that we represent as BLSA and the CEOs that are in our midst. But Rehabe, so let me tell you that as much as I have tried to drive the SMME agenda, I have dismally failed. I'm sitting with my executive trying to come up with another way of, how do we tackle this, and what strategy or tactic do we need to use? So when Bonang and Temba spoke about Bonang, that you had a conversation with at the beginning of the year. Now, Bonang was my predecessor. I took over from Bonang at BLSA. So Bonang and I started an initiative called the BLSA Connect when we got to BLSA. It must have been 2017, where we were saying to these CEOs, to this big business, to this white monopoly capital that I lead, where we were saying, already according to legislation, you are required to spend 3% of your net profit after tax towards enterprise and supply development. About the outcry from SMMEs and Black SMMEs in particular in this country is not so much the access to finance, it is the access to markets. And the markets that they are struggling to access is precisely you as white monopoly capital or as the private sector. It's difficult for a Black SMME in this country to get a contract or to get in the distribution list or to get a tender or to get work from a Nedbank, from a Bidvest, from a Standard Bank, from a Vodacom, all our SMMEs have to end up doing work with government. Even when they want to move away from the public sector to the private sector, we don't give them opportunities. And yet we spend 3% of our net profit after tax towards enterprise and supply development. And the question that Bonang and I asked was that, who are we developing then and to what end? Because you see, what corporate South Africa is doing to our Black SMMEs is this notion of perpetual training without graduation. And it really pisses me off, because then they've got these useless training schemes that it doesn't matter even if I were to come as a Busisiwe Mavuso and say that I've got 25 years experience in corporate and I'm a chartered accountant by profession, and I've just set up Busisiwe Mavuso Incorporated Chartered Accountants, and I want business with you as a Nedbank. They will want to send me to these useless training programs. Now, they don't even look at who are you, what do you need, what does your business need, or whatever the case is. You go through all these trainings, and as if it's not enough, you still don't get included in their supplier distribution. Even if you are included in the supplier distribution list, if you get a contract, you're actually going to be very likely, you still don't get a contract from them. And I say to them, does it make sense for us to spend billions of rands on training these people, and there isn't an outcome in terms of, now that I've trained you, you now qualify to access these opportunities within Nedbank. Now, that is not the thinking of the private sector today. And why, I don't know. Probably it's partly because of the BBBE legislation and act that we have in this country is imperfect. But you see, it doesn't matter what the BBBE Act looks like. Private sector has to have the conscience to do the right thing. I was saying earlier on, if you're going to be sitting in a country where so many people don't have disposable incomes, who is going to bank with you? Who is going to buy from you? Who is going to make sure that your business continues to be sustainable? So so we tried to do that. So the BLSA Connect was meant to identify these Black SMMEs, and we're saying, give us some of your 3% of the NPAT so that we look at Riabeto and we say, this is the services that you provide, but Nedbank wants you to conform to these 4 things. And for you to be able to conform to these 4 things, this is the training that we are going to give you. But after giving you this training, you are guaranteed that you are going to be in a position to access work from Nedbank. Now, Riabeto, I didn't get far with that. Promise you, only one company subscribed to it. One out of the 200 companies that I represent, one, and that was Capitec. They didn't buy into it. They were saying, we have spent so much money, working with our suppliers and getting them to be level 1, triple BE, whatever that means. And you and I know that level 1, triple BE is utter rubbish because they are still level 1, triple BE, and they are still not transformed, So we have spent so much money to get them to level 1, triple BE. So we don't know if we actually want to start this journey again with Black SMMEs. Now, this says to me that we are working with a corporate South Africa or with white monopoly capital who doesn't get it, who don't understand that the reason why we are doing this is because we are trying to normalize our society, because our society is highly abnormal. And how do you normalize the society? You normalize the society by including more people, within the economic mainstream, because the more people you have outside the economic mainstream, the more it's dangerous for you, the more it's unsustainable for you. So we failed at that, and I think I've had conversations with the Ministry of Small Business Development, and I was saying, how do we work with you to try and advance this thing? So that is the environment that we find ourselves in, Riabe. So if I were to tell you what to do, I would be lying. I honestly have no clue, because as I'm saying, I'm leading white monopoly capital, which refuses to see reason, which refuses to engage with these things from the lens through which they should be engaging with them. And hence, I was saying, when I was answering Mandla, to say, policy exists for a reason. The reason why Norway is a leader in female leadership, government was very clear. They made it policy that 40% of all your boards are going to be women for the next 10 years. And in your senior management, leadership, so such a percentage is going to move. Policy can be used as an instrument to drive the transformation agenda. But we are failing. This government is failing to force the hand of corporate South Africa to do the right thing in as far as this is concerned. So in the absence of policy, how do you drag white monopoly capital kicking and screaming to do the right thing? Because at the moment, there is very little interest in rehabilitation. Even when we have seen the anarchy, that we have just seen as a country, we still don't get it. Temba, I know you are probably going to be running out of time. These are issues that are very important to me. These are issues that, and this is important for me, and it's not just important for me, it's personal for me, because I come from this very system, of oppression and dispossession. I've got so many of my family members whom I have to carry on a month-to-month basis. 20,000 is what I spend to distribute amongst my family members just so that I can make sure that they go to bed with a full stomach at night. I won't even tell you how many of my cousins' kids I'm taking through school. So this is personal for me, because until government changes policy to force corporate South Africa to do the right thing, until this white monopoly capital that I lead gets it, then it means that I'm going to continue carrying this burden, Temba, over to you. Thank you.
I almost want to say I don't want you to stop, because these are conversations that we need to have. And until we stop treating events, engagements like this as events, and we start treating them as fertile ground where we get wisdom and knowledge that we need to go implement on our everyday lives to bring change into our lives, to better our country, to be people who are in positions and places to to hold these government and to hold business accountable in creating a South Africa that is equal for all, giving equal opportunities for everyone, and then we still have a long way to go. It's so sad that we have come to the end of our webinar today, but Prof Mavuso, Little Big Ideas will definitely be in touch because there's so much more that needs to be done. We need to revisit the BLSA Connect and to see how we can assist in making that a reality, because it's not just a program, it's a necessity to bring our economy to where it's supposed to be. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. If you could please just stay connected to our social media and so forth, for you to get information on when we're hosting our next one, which is going to be at the end of October, so that we can introduce to you who the CEO is going to be, so that you can also spread the word, so we can get the conversation going, so that we can drive for change in our country. Prof Mavuso, as a person that follows you and follows your weekly newsletters, I'm honored for you to have agreed to be with us today. You are a definite asset in this current generation, and many might not see the work that you're doing, but for generations we're going to benefit from it, because you're changing lives and you're changing minds, and we are forever grateful for that. So thank you for joining us. And thank you very much, everyone. We've come to the end of our...
Thank you very much, Temba.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.